Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Cold War and its effects on America. For part 2, we're going to talk about why the United States and Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war in 1962. And then we're also going to talk about what the space race was and why it was important for the United States to become a global leader in technology and in science. Again, some vocabulary you're going to see during this unit. Arms race. Arms race is this idea that countries were rapidly building up weapons because they wanted to become more powerful. You also see the idea of a military-industrial complex, which is the idea that war and big business are tied together, and this was said in a famous speech by President Eisenhower. You also see the word mutually assured destruction, which is the idea that using nuclear weapons will result in the destruction of the world. Another word you'll see is public service announcement. Public service announcements are broadcasts made by television or newspapers with advice on how to keep the people safe. So we're not going to go into the details of the Cold War again because we just reviewed them for part 1. But again, the main idea is to remember that there were two sides to the nuclear conflict. The Soviet Union supported communism in Eastern Europe, and the United States supported democracy in Western Europe. These alliances formed into major alliances such as the Western Bloc nations and NATO, and the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc nations of the Warsaw Pact. Both countries would use proxies to fight wars, as we've seen in Korea and Vietnam. So we need to talk about what the nuclear Cold War was. The nuclear Cold War was the idea that there was a rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, and this made the Cold War even more dangerous because both nations developed nuclear weapons. Both countries had an arms race, which was the idea that both countries competed to have the biggest and most dangerous weapons. With an arms race comes the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And this was the idea that one nuclear attack from one country would result in both countries firing nuclear weapons, and the whole war would be a nuclear war and everybody would be dead. Again, mutually assured destruction. Destruction of everybody. The threat of nuclear war had a tremendous impact on the United States at home. It caused fear in the United States. There were public service announcements such as duck and cover, and I have that on Google Classroom as well, which were made to make Americans feel safer in the event of a nuclear attack. Again, the idea would be that if a nuclear attack was coming, you would simply
You duck, and then you cover.
And this would keep you safe from a nuclear bomb. People also built fallout shelters, which would be shelters underground from your house to help protect you from a nuclear bomb. The height of the nuclear Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened after Fidel Castro launched a communist revolution inside Cuba. After Castro was in power, the United States made multiple plots to either try to assassinate or invade Cuba. One of the most famous being the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the United States used Cuban refugees from Miami to try and invade Cuba. Castro's army easily defeated them, and this failed. Nevertheless, after the Bay of Pigs, Castro looked to the Soviet Union for help. And in 1962, the Soviet Union agreed to build nuclear missile bases on the island of Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States. These missiles from Cuba, if launched, could hit any major city within the United States. So this obviously made the United States scared. The United States decided they would blockade any materials coming to Cuba to help create nuclear weapons. The blockade itself could lead to nuclear war because if the blockade was broken by the Soviets, the United States would have to fire on Soviet ships, and this could lead to an all-out war. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev of the Soviet Union reached a deal. The United States would remove missiles they had in Turkey, and the Soviet Union would remove missiles they had in Cuba, and a big nuclear war was averted for the time being. So the Soviet Union and United States did not just race to build nuclear weapons. They also raced to space. The reason why the space race is so important is because if you control the science and technology to go to space, it means you can spy on other countries from space, you can wage war from space, and there are many more possibilities that are opened if you control space. The Soviet Union actually launches both the first satellite and first human into space. Both countries had also experimented with dogs and monkeys as well. Nevertheless, the United States makes history by being the first, and so far only, country to put a man on the moon on June 20th, 1969, basically solidifying them winning the space race. So as we conclude the Cold War, the major events of it, there's some big questions we need to ask. So why did the United States and Soviet Union come to the brink of nuclear war in 1962? We also need to think, what was the space race? Why was that space race so important? What would have happened if the United States lost the space race? What ideas does going to space give for Americans? You can think of nationalism and pride in your country. So the Cold War was a very important time for the United States and would help set our foreign policy for years to come. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I can't wait to see the work that you submit. Take care, and see you next week.